Evelyn. Welcome to the Neuron podcast.
Hi, thrilled to be here.
I'm looking forward to this conversation because I know that eating is a very challenging part of a parent's life. And what I love is that the work you do and the book that you have is evidence-based. And I was having fun sifting through the literature a little bit and seeing what's out there. And, I think this will help give parents some sort of guidance when it comes to eating. So before we begin, I'm curious how you ended up in what you're doing today.
I'll make it a long story short. Elise and I, by the way, this is a co-project. Elise and I co-wrote this book together. And this was over 30 years ago. And we were working separately in private practice and just witnessing the suffering of people on diets, and blaming them and it not working. And so our traditional ways of working weren't so good either. So we went to the literature, we factored in our clinical experience, also looked at what contemporary writers were having to say, and came up with the 10 principles of intuitive eating. And so we can say that intuitive eating was research inspired, but fast forward today, we have almost 200 studies on our work validating it. And I think for your audience, what you might be interested to know, that a lot of the principles were actually influenced by the parent-child feeding relationship, notably the works of L. Birch. And what her work has shown is that, and I'm not throwing parents under the bus. I'm a parent, and I think it's one of the most humbling things you can do in life. But what her research showed is that if well-meaning parents rigidly restrict their kids' eating, it actually creates the very opposite of what they're intending. This is let's say a parent is forbidding all sugar, all desserts. That's the kid that ends up, really going to town at a birthday party, stuffing their pockets full of candy and so on, because you can't get you focus on. And then what they tend to do is sneak the candy or the sugar and then end up feeling guilty about that. And so it gets really complex. And so it undermines their little body's a sense of trust, because the eating becomes opportunistic versus based on, what's going on right now with my hunger and fullness and those kinds of things.
You have painted the exact picture that everybody paints as a parent and says, we are restricting the foods and we should be deciding what's good for you, what's not, how much you should eat. But then on the other end, there are parents who were raised a certain way of like, finish what's in your plate. You need to finish it all and eat it all, and are continuing that cycle or are just not sure which direction to take. So how can we take this intuitive eating, or first, I guess we should define what it is and what it looks like, and then see how we can bring that into our homes with our kids.
Intuitive eating is basically a self-care eating framework that relies on the internal wisdom of the body. And I define it in many different ways. I'm talking to healthcare professionals and scientists, they'll say, and the basic mechanism is through interoceptive awareness. And and I know you know what that is, but that's our ability to perceive physical sensations that arise within the body. And what's so significant about that, it goes beyond just hunger and fullness. Interoceptive awareness, physical sensations are also reflected in our emotions and our feelings that we have. Sometimes when you hear the phrase, "Oh my God, I had a visceral reaction or had a gut reaction," we're really talking about a form of interoceptive awareness. And so it's really rather profound. And so I would say at the heart of this, when we're working with parents and kids, it's about trusting that your kids' hunger and fullness cues can work, that they can self-regulate. And probably the youngest where this really gets started, we addressed it in our 4th edition, our most recent edition of the book. And it's baby intuitive eating, which is basically baby-led weaning. And for the parents I have worked with over the years who have been involved in this, where they let the babies, self-regulate, it can actually be really quite delightful and quite healing, to witness a child be able to feed themselves and enough in which they're able to grow and so on. And if you ever want to look at videos of this, there's an account that I love, Feeding Littles on Instagram, and it's a team of a dietitian and an occupational therapist. In fact, the dietitian's also trained in intuitive eating, and they do a marvelous job of addressing parents' concerns from babies to all the way up to, toddler and elementary school age kids.
I'm just thinking of a parent now who's hearing this for the first time. And when you have a baby, you're just always worried that they haven't eaten, they haven't eaten enough. And you want to make sure that they are full and they're getting the nutrients that they need. Will a baby naturally just stop when they're not hungry anymore?
Yeah, I mean, that's been shown over and over again, with breastfeeding. And, I think if we step back and look at our culture right now, and our culture is so toxic with diet culture, and this idea that, you have to be extra vigilant, monitoring every single thing that you are eating. And it ends up creating problems. It increases the risk of eating disorders. And one of the things I I challenge parents, especially parents of young children who are planning to have families, is a challenge with the aspiration of what would it be like to end the legacy of diet culture at your kitchen table. If you think
Mm.
about your own experiences, and maybe the fraught relationship you've had with eating and your body, and we don't want to pass that on to our kids. So how do we protect them? And intuitive eating is one of those ways. And what happens is, if you're giving well-meaning suggestions like finish your plate, you can't eat this, you can't eat that, it doesn't allow the kid to self regulate. It creates a bigger problem in the long term. And again, parents are very well meaning. This might be very new information. And in our book, we have a whole chapter dedicated to raising an intuitive eater. There's even a new book out called Raising an Intuitive Eater. It's a derivative of
Mm.
our work that goes even deeper into parenting and so on. So I'm happy to say there's a lot of really good resources on this.
I read your book about 2 years ago, and I remember changing what I do when I'm eating. Like, sometimes I'd eat because I was bored,
Uh-huh.
and I noticed that I was doing that only after reading it, and then I changed the way that I was doing things. I would always ask myself, like, "Do I need this, or do I just want it because I have nothing else to do right now, or does my body really want it?" And what else goes into the thinking behind intuitive eating?
Well, there's many things. I mean, there's pleasure, like
Mm,
aiming for satisfaction. If you think about it, that when you aim for satisfaction in a meal, what would that feel like? Think about what a satisfying meal would be, How do you what sounds good and how do you want to feel when you finish? It's kind of an easy question, but if you've been dieting on all your life or been on different kinds of food programs in which their influencers are telling you what to eat, when to eat, how to eat, it can really seem like a very far off idea. And yet, even though it's like the fifth principle of intuitive eating, I often start patients at that point because it's curious, it's pleasure based, and it's personal. I can't tell you what's satisfying for you versus
mm,
what's satisfying for me. We can talk about what might make that, the case in terms of texture, temperature, these kinds of things. But another thing we can consider is what else impacts satisfaction besides the foods we're eating. Well, let's think about our environment. So for a little thought experiment, think about maybe your most favorite meal, your just most favorite meal, and you get to have it with a significant other, and you can't wait to eat it. And just as about the food is being served, you and your partner get into a horrible, intense fight.
mm.
Do you think that that meal is going to be satisfying? So there's all these things that go into play with this. And so if we go back to the parent-child feeding relationship, if there's a lot of pressure on the kids to eat a certain way, that creates anxiety at the table. And the table
Mhm.
is a time to connect with your kids. As they get older, there's a lot of good research showing that actually having family meals together, to the degree that you can, you don't have to be perfect about this, it really bodes well in terms of how kids end up doing overall in life and getting less into trouble and these kinds of things. And I think because at the heart of it, there's communication that's happening.
And being more mindful together and spending that time together
Yeah,
is so nice as a family. But I understand too that it's not every family that can do that. But when we can, like you
yeah.
said, when we can, when it works for our family. Um,
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be dinner. It could be breakfast. It
mhm,
could be a snack. It could be lunch. It could be all different kinds of
mm.
things, depending what works for your family.
I'm thinking of kids that are maybe a little bit younger. You spoke about babies kind of having that natural instinct, but I have 3 kids and, one out of the 3 likes to indulge more, and we always struggled with that, like, how to support that. If sweets are okay, but one will definitely eat the entire box if he can. Where's the limit when it comes to intuitive eating, and how can we teach this to our kids if we notice that they're struggling with it?
Well, we want a couple of things. Is we want flexible responding. Use the parent. Know your family and your kids and your dynamics really really well. But one of the challenges I have seen is that if a parent has their own unresolved issues around eating and
Mm,
their body, they sometimes project that onto their
mm,
kids. I'll give you an example. I'll never forget this. My son, who's now an adult, when he was 2, I just remember this meal so well because we were temporarily living in an apartment and it was very small quarters. I thought, I'm going to make a really good meal. And I made lasagna and all the sides to go
nice.
with it. And I
Yeah.
made my favorite dessert, a carrot cake, and
Mm,
served everyone the same amount of food. And my son finishes his carrot cake and he says, more mommy. And I got to tell you, at that time, the mommy in me was thinking, dude, that's enough. But then the intuitive eater scientist part came out and just said, let's let him do what he's going to do. So I sliced him another piece, the exact same size. And do you know he ate one bite? I'm done. And he ran off and played. So in my mind, I have this story because he's
Yeah.
asking more. He's going to have, two whole pieces. And so what happens is if food stays really exciting,
Mm,
the kid becomes over preoccupied and over focused on it, so that's
mm,
where the challenge is. And so in terms of looking at some, loving boundaries and guidelines, having, as a parent, you get to decide what's going to constitute a meal. You get to decide what constitutes the snack. And then that's the role of the parent, and the role and the job of the kid is to decide how much of that they're going to eat. So you get to decide, what's there. And
mm,
so that can help in terms of setting some of these parameters. But if the food is sometimes revered as extra special and only really just sometimes maybe if mom or dad is in the mood, that keeps it really exciting. And there's this interesting phenomenon called habituation, and that's been
mm,
studied in a lot of different areas. And habituation is about novelty, and that when something is new, it's pretty exciting. But after exposure over and over again, the excitement goes away. And the best description I ever heard of this was from a scientist in habituation talking about falling in love. And imagine, the first time you were falling in love, maybe with a significant other, just a first, or your first crush, and that person says, I love you for the first time to you, and you are floating. It's amazing. And the world has stopped, and rainbows and butterflies and unicorns are all over the place. So, and now imagine 5 years later, if you're in a committed relationship, that same person says, I love you, and it's nice, but it doesn't have the same ecstasy kind of
mm,
feeling. And so habituation has been studied in many different situations, including foods. And it has been shown that when you're exposed to a food over and over again, it's not a big deal. You'll still like it, but the excitement is what's different. And the
mm,
challenge is if someone has been chronically on diets and food restriction plans, the food stays exciting. And then when someone goes off a diet, they often will eat more of those foods they weren't allowed to have. And now they're like, oh, I've got my own evidence. I need more rules. And the food stays exciting. And so where the answer lies in this is in our principle of making peace with food, which is based on habituation. It's also based on the research of L.L. Birch, the parent-child feeding relationship, showing that if you keep things forbidden, it becomes something that becomes people become more preoccupied on. And so we want to make foods kind of, emotionally equivalent from that perspective. And so it can be a really fun principle to work with. Sometimes parents, when they've had very strict rules around eating, that might make them feel uncomfortable in the beginning. But when you watch what ends up happening with your kids eating, it can actually be quite delightful
mm,
in that way. But it takes a while. The parents need to wrap their mind around this in terms of recognizing, looking at the big picture, how
mm.
important mental health is. That
Yes.
we talk a lot about physical health, but mental health is just as important. So, body, mind are not inseparable. And if we're constantly having anxiety about what we're eating, every single morsel, that doesn't have a good impact on our mental health. And then if you start looking at something called allostatic load is basically the amount of stress that's put on the body, and it affects all of our systems.
Mm,
And there's an extra release of cortisol. When allostatic load is high, it doesn't bode well in terms of for health and those kinds of things. And so part of this making peace with food is about having ease with your eating, having ease with your body. And right now in our culture, it's almost as if there's this idea that you're one bite away from disaster, that this food's
yeah.
either going to kill you or cure you.
Mhm,
And there was a study that was done by Paul Rosen over 20 years ago. And in his study, he looked at 4 different countries and their attitudes and relationships to food. And what they found is that the French they cared the least about health and cared the most about their eating, the quality of their eating. And to no surprise, they enjoyed their eating the most. And the Americans enjoyed their eating the least and worried about their health the most. And so,
interesting. That was 20 years
yeah,
ago?
yeah, over 20 years
Wow.
ago. And what he was writing is he was saying, we think so much about food, curing us or, contributing to disease. We haven't really looked at what is the impact of the stress about the worry of these kinds of things. And then we can get into the weeds in the science, and so many things so many studies that are reported in the news are basically studies about association and not causation. And
Yeah.
then all of a sudden it becomes a rule. Don't eat this food or make sure you have this food, when actually it's not that hard and fast as sometimes people are led to believe based on what you're reading. And nutrition is a relatively, a new science.
There are two things you said that really stood out to me right now that make peace, with food. I think that is so powerful because we don't, right? We have concerns around certain foods in our house, not having the certain foods, whether we should eat it, how much we should eat it. It's so much. And it comes down to that piece that you mentioned. Everything we're basically talking about does fall within our emotional or mental health, and it
Yeah.
has an impact on us. And that's what's interesting to me, that we are talking about food and eating, but there's a big part of this that is our emotional and mental health. So I think about people who do struggle with emotional eating, and I've struggled with this myself. How do we get out of that if we do want to, you know, maybe reconnect with our body and its needs when it comes to eating? How do we make our way towards intuitive eating?
Yeah, really, really good question. And so emotional eating is a big topic, to
Mm,
really unpack. In fact, this is one of the principles that we tweak the language in. And the principle is coping with your feelings with kindness. Because we found the way that we worded the principle before, it was, cope with your emotions without food, without using food. And what's still at the heart of the principle is having a diverse way of coping. That's the
mm,
bottom line.
mm.
However, it does no good to pathologize emotional eating. If you think about it, emotional eating is part of normal life. Pleasure is part
Yes.
of normal
Yeah.
life. And so pathologizing that is really, really problematic. So I want to make sure that we're not doing that.
Good. Yeah.
But what's really at the heart of this is having diverse ways of coping and figuring out what your needs are. When something is going on, what is it that I'm feeling right now?
Mm,
And what do I need right now that's related to that feeling? And
mm.
that sounds like really basic kinds of questions, but it's really amazing if you've been somebody who's been very, as a parent, very other focused about getting everyone else's needs met at the expense of yours. You might not even have a sense of what that is.
True. It's
And
true. Yeah.
so part of it just
Mm,
begins a little bit with this self-reflection. And
mm,
depending on how often this is going on or how distressing it is, it might be helpful to work with a health
mm,
professional. Are we looking at some occasional coping, or is this something that we're looking into a diagnostic category of binge eating disorder, in which it's
mhm,
happening for over 3 months, at least once a week, and so on? And
mm.
sometimes what people might perceive as a binge is actually not even a binge. They're unhappy or disappointed with their food choice, but it doesn't mean that it's an all and out binge. And so there's ways of working with this. And I think about the Rumi poet about the house guest, and the house guest is about the emotions. And he's like, invite them in, give them a cup of tea.
Yes.
And so many times our tendency is to want to avoid and ignore the feeling. But what
Mm,
ends up happening is it tends to grow. We can certainly temporarily, distract ourselves from feelings, but at some point it needs to be dealt with. And so
yeah.
it's looking at what those things are. And then where it gets really tricky is if you have rigid rules around eating, if you have been restricting your eating, your energy intake, when you're not getting enough to eat, our body is wired to survive a famine. And and famines have
Mm,
existed ever since people have been on this earth. And so we are still wired to survive a famine, even though there's grocery stores open 24/7 around the corner. And so what happens is when you're not getting enough to eat, even though it's intentional, your body is like, oh my gosh, we've got to gear up here. And so what happens is you've had all this restraint around your eating, and something comes along. It can be an emotion, it can be powerful hunger. We call it primal hunger. And then all restraint is broken. And
mm.
all of a sudden, there's a researcher calls it what the hell effect. It's also known as the restraint theory. And when she said what the hell effect, I go, oh my God, you're talking about my patients. And that's when there's also this mindset of all or none eating. I blew it, so I might as well eat all of the things. And since I'm never ever going to have it again, I might as well get it now while I can and before I change my mind. So it can get really complex. And if we can do it for just a minute, I just want to emphasize the importance of biology here that's so underestimated. You know, I love to surf, so I'm always playing in the waves, and it is well known. If a big set comes, you go under, you hold your breath, and you come back up, and you hope there's not another wave coming crashing down on you. And sometimes you have to wait a little longer than what you want. And so finally, when you finally get to breathe, it's not this polite inhale; it's this big gasp for air, this big gasp for life. And no one is saying, oh my God, you are out of control with your breathing. You have
Mm.
a breathing problem. Everybody knows it's a natural compensatory response of air restriction, oxygen restriction. And we
Mm,
need to have that same perspective when it comes to food,
mm,
that if you have been consistently under eating for whatever reason, or let's just say you had a chaotic day, you had lunch at 11, you're planning to have dinner, but get pulled into a meeting. And then by the time you get home, you are in that place of primal hunger. Primal hunger is intense. It's urgent. It tends not to feel good. There's nothing wrong with you. That's actually your body working. So now let's combine this. You have rigid rules, you've got this primal hunger, and you've got some unpleasant emotions. They don't have to be unpleasant, but often they
mm.
are. That becomes really, really powerful. So it's looking at, okay, how am I doing consistently at nourishing my body? We don't have to be perfect. Is it pretty good in general? And how about on this day? I might not be intentionally restricting, but we're human. We can have days where it's like, oh my gosh, I forgot I didn't have a meal, or I went too long without eating. And how is my mindset in terms of flexibility? Am I very rigid? Do I have this all or none thinking, or do my thoughts go into what I call the toilet vortex, where it just sucks you into this negativity, and now you're feeling even worse on top of everything else? And so it's kind of sorting through all of that, and that you're not a bad or good person based on what you ate, and ultimately looking at, what can I learn from this experience? And if I was given this same set of conditions, what might I do differently next time? Just
Mm.
looking at that. And I find if we can find a wisdom component to our suffering, that helps us to let go and move on and move through it in a different way next time.
I love everything you just said. And it always comes back. And I know this is difficult for parents to hear sometimes, but it comes back to us. What you've just described is really putting that work into ourselves to have that
Yeah.
relationship with food. And I think it'll come a little bit more easily when it comes to teaching our kids how to build the relationship with food as well, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
What we do as parents is more powerful
Mm,
than anything that we say.
mm,
And so having this ease of eating is a beautiful gift you can be giving your family. And it starts with you.
it
And
does.
no worries if you have this fraught relationship. It's all workable, but it does take some unlearning,
Mm.
in working through all of these things.
Let's talk about that relationship that we have with food just a little bit more because I want to end our conversation by talking about teenagers.
Mm.
There are some research studies that have suggested there was a 2010 study that looked at 365 teens, and 45% of them were encouraged by their parents to diet, and 58% of them were weight shamed by their parents as well. So those are big numbers and scary numbers too, because they're still learning what the relationship is with food and how to build that relationship. If a parent is bringing in, as you've mentioned a few times now, their own relationship, perhaps, self-image or their body images, and now they're a parent and they don't want their child to experience maybe what they're experiencing or have the relationship they have with food. How do we kind of work through that to make sure that we create this safe environment for our kids when it comes to food?
That's a really great question. And so part of it's coming down to values. What are the values you want to transmit in your family? And so a couple of ones I'd like to encourage is something around the idea that human beings are sacred. Our bodies are sacred. And so because of that belief and value, we don't gossip about bodies, we don't criticize bodies, and we don't compliment them, because
Mm.
that also sets that into place, this body hierarchy, that some bodies are worthy and some are not.
Thank you for
And the same
mentioning
thing
that.
with eating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
In terms of not criticizing people's food choices, same idea. And so if we can instill this as a value at home, diet culture is toxic and it's everywhere, but at least we've got some foundation.
Mhm.
But with that study that you just quoted, now we're looking at home as not a safe place at all.
Mm.
Home is where the kid is being weight shamed
Yep.
and encouraged to diet. And when you
Mhm.
look at the studies on teens and dieting, the statistics are quite profound, that dieting is one of the most single biggest predictor of getting an eating disorder.
Mm.
And there's this famous study, it's a very long study, longitudinal study, prospective rather,
Mm.
10-year-long study on preteens. They followed them from age 11 to age 21. So there are 2,000 teens that they followed. And what they were looking at is dieting and weight suppression behaviors. And what they found, it's not this innocuous phase or behavior. that if teens are involved in these kinds of things, it actually escalates and carries through with them through young adulthood. And now they're on the third decade of the study. It's called Project EAT. And so we see the escalation of eating disorders. We see a lot of problems with this. And so dieting is not the solution. That's part of the problem. That's part of suffering. And we don't want to have that suffering. And when you look at bullying and weight teasing, it's one of the key risk factors also in terms of eating disorders, in terms of those starting. It's really, really problematic. So we need to start at home. And for those listening, if anything I'm saying is upsetting to you, then I'd say, maybe it's time to just to take a look at this. I'm not trying to shame any parent, but to look at what kind of environment do we need in order for our teen to thrive. And these kids aren't going to be home for very long, and teens are going to do what they want to do outside the house. They've got ways. I've been humbled working with teens as well. I love working with teens, and they're going to be on their own at some point. We want to create, autonomy and not this self-doubt and so forth. So it's a critical issue.
And as you mentioned, home should be that safe space, and they're going to encounter a lot at school. I recently spoke to a school counselor, actually just last week, and they work in a high school, and their secondary two girls specifically are struggling a lot with not eating. They're restricting their eating, and the counselor is trying to get them to eat and find ways to have more conversations around health and food and why it's important. But they're all restricting for some, and they're afraid of eating disorders. If perhaps I know that there are teachers that listen to this and clinicians as well. Do you have advice for them if this is the case for a child they're working with, or even a teacher who notices something within their classroom with a specific student of restricting?
Well, yeah, it's because we're looking at this is a high risk for eating disorder in this age, teenagers and actually even younger. And so I'd be looking at getting an evaluation. And once again, I'd be looking at the environment of the classroom and the environment of the school in terms of what's the policy on bullying? Most schools will say, oh, no tolerance on bullying. And yet many times bullying around weight and teasing slides. I'd be looking at that in terms of what kind of environment are we also cultivating? Are we nurturing and nourishing these young minds and bodies, or are we adding, more stress to this? I would say by the time someone starts noticing these kinds of behaviors, it's been happening for a longer period of time, usually, so it's critical.
I want to go back quickly to parents with young kids, and then we'll end our conversation. It's really hard for me to end this with you. I have so many other questions, and it's a fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
I just want to talk about grandparents, because we talked about creating that safe space in the home, and grandparents might not, or family members might not have the same views. So even if we are trying to raise an intuitive eater, and doing it ourselves, we might have people that criticize their child's weight. You said praise, and I'm so happy you said that, because it's really kind of ignored as if it's nothing. But my daughter, has been told by family members, wow, you're so thin. She's 7 years old. She had no idea of that concept. And I think of another study, which was an earlier study in 2006, that shows that by the age of 6, girls are already have the idea or the concept in their mind of wanting to be thinner. So I really do think we have to be aware of that. Do you have any advice for parents who are trying to implement this kind of environment in their home? And what they can do to, I guess, I don't know what the word is, right? But to have this conversation with grandparents.
I'll suggest, and I call it, setting loving boundaries,
Thank you.
And it's having a conversation with your parents about the values that want to instill in your kids and in your family. And that they don't even have to agree with the values, but you want to ask them to respect that. And here's what respect looks like: not commenting on bodies, not complimenting on bodies, not talking about bodies under the guise of being concerned and worried and those kinds of things, and not criticizing food choices. And, it's so interesting to me. Over the years, I've had some parents I've worked with that don't want to have this conversation with their parents, but it has an impact on the kids. And so sometimes I say, you know what, grandma, grandpa don't get a pass. When you have loved ones doing the weight teasing and comments, that is more toxic than someone at school. It's not great for someone at school doing it, but when coming from the family, it has more of an impact. And so I have found that to get buy-in, you explain what you want, but they don't have to agree with it. It's just in any think about your parenting values, what you value, maybe what time your kids go to bed, or using electrical device, using, you know, cell phones and all
Screens.
these
Yeah.
kinds of screens. Thank you. Electrical devices. I'm like, oh, way back in the
Same.
day.
Yeah.
Parents have different values.
Mm.
And your own parents or the grandparents might not agree, but you're allowed to have that, to raise the family in the way that you think is right and makes sense for
Mm.
you. So that's what I would encourage you to do, is have conversations, and to really set it up to have the conversations not during a tense time, not when
No.
grandma just made a comment, when it's a calm time,
Mm.
And in these boundary talks, what I usually suggest is, assuming it's a pretty good relationship, saying something truthful that you appreciate about the relationship. Gosh, Mom, I've really appreciated all the help you've done, whatever it happens to be, and you name it, what it is. But there's a concern I have, and I want to talk to you, and I want to see if I can get some support. And what really culture is so toxic when it comes to bodies, and I don't want my kids to suffer the way I've suffered. You don't know how I've suffered in terms of how I feel about my body and my eating. And I don't want to pass this on to the kids, and what this would look like. And again, you name what it would look like, not making comments on food choices, bodies, gossiping about celebrities and influencers' bodies, and these kinds of things. If what they do on their own time is their own business, but not in front of the kids, that kind of idea. And then, here's the important part of this conversation. If the grandparents agree and say, yes, of course, I'll support you. What's really important in that calm conversation is having the conversation, and what are you going to do if they forget? Because if they've been in habit
Oh,
of
yeah.
making a comment,
Yeah.
they're going to forget. We have habit of mind.
Yes.
It happens. And so it doesn't have to be a big thing, but have that conversation. Gosh, Mom, if you forget, what's a polite way I can remind you? And it could be anything like
So good.
stop, or hey, remember the combo?
Yeah.
And because you've had the conversation, it's not a big dissertation, and people aren't getting all mad. It's like training a puppy. If parents have been in the habit of doing this, they're gonna fumble. Even when they say, oh yeah, of course I'll support you, they're gonna forget. And not personalizing it, is just remind them like you would do a puppy. Puppies who you love. Remember, we're not gonna go there. But we're not gonna do
We will
And
forever think of our parents now this way.
and if you're not prepared to reinforce the boundary, then my suggestion is wait until you are, because otherwise you can have the talk, but if it's not reinforced, it makes it really, really incredibly wobbly. So that's my suggestion.
That's amazing advice. I love that conversation.
Thank
That's
you.
good.
Thank you.
It's
Yeah.
true that you have to do it in the right moment and give them compliments, because or else it doesn't go down very well. They
Yeah.
don't. Yeah, I get that. To end our conversation, what would be some do's and don'ts that you can offer parents right now that are listening in terms of intuitive eating within their homes that they can follow? Something simple enough that they can start tomorrow.
Oh my gosh. It's such a straightforward question. And all of a sudden I'm like, wow, it's big. I think basically one of the biggest do's is to trust their kids in their eating, and not to put pressure on them to eat, and not to to say that, in order to have dessert, you got to eat the vegetables. There's actually been research on this. It actually makes vegetable consumption even less, because it's kind of saying this thing is so nasty, you have to be rewarded in order to eat it.
It's true.
Yeah. That's probably one of the biggest things. And I'd be looking at, what can we do to make the table time, the meal time, pleasant, and looking at what happens at your time when you get together. If there's a lot of fights, are there a lot of like inquisitions about homework and things done? And what I would encourage you to do, yes, we need to have those conversations with our kids, but do they have to happen at mealtime? Can we have mealtime be kind of this sacred space? That's what I would be looking at in a nutshell. Yeah.
I love those, and I think it's simple enough for us to try to start these two things tomorrow. I love that.
Thank you.
How can people learn more from you? You mentioned you have new books out as well. I will put all the links to that in our show notes. But is there anything you want to
Thank you.
mention, or any website for people?
Yeah, our website at intuitiveeating.org is probably the best place to go for information. I'm on Instagram. That's my main social media. And in there, I have links in my bio to all kinds of resources, interviews that we've done, podcasts, and those kinds of things. So that's
your
what I would
Instagram
suggest.
is your full name?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, it's Evelyn Tribole. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I will add that link.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, for chatting with me. And I have a feeling parents will reach out and have more questions. I might reach out again, but thank you. I hope we do get to chat again.
It was wonderful. Had a great time talking. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.